It is evident that the class is rich in comprehensible input. The examples that we have seen show this. Yet, if all the classes were composed of comprehensible input only, children would find it difficult to produce the language themselves. Though it is true that children need exposure to English in the class, they also need chances to speak and write in the language in order to learn it. Output can be described as having a double function. On the one hand, we know what children know as a result of what they say and write. Output helps us determine the product of learning, since it helps us assess how much children have learned. Output, then, is a way into children's interlanguage systems, as we will see in future classes. On the other hand, output has a central role in children's linguistic development, that is, in the process of learning. It is well documented that output has three main functions. In a foundational work developed by Swain, these three functions are very well detailed. The first one being the fact that the student will notice, that is, become aware of a linguistic problem as he or she is using the language. So in consequence, noticing the problem will push the learner to modify his or her output. And finally, by doing so, the learner may sometimes be forced into a more syntactic processing mode than might occur in comprehension, which means that the processing of language and the acquisition of language goes deeper when there is output. Let us analyze each of these functions of output more in depth. Firstly, as we know, output is one of the triggers for noticing. As students are producing the language, they may encounter a problem leading them to recognize what they do not know, or know only partially. In other words, the activity of producing the target language may prompt second language learners to consciously recognize some of their linguistic problems. It may bring to their attention something they need to discover about the L2. So, output is a means of identifying the flaws in your linguistic competence. As we said before, noticing pushes the learner to modify his or her output, so even with or without implicit or explicit feedback provided from an interlocutor, the learner will still notice a gap in their own knowledge when they encounter a problem and will try to modify this production. In almost all the literature on communication strategies, there is evidence that learners do notice problems as they speak and do try to do something about them. But what do they do when they notice the problem? Do they focus on morphology and syntax? Well, they focus on all. In fact, there is evidence that the restructuring of the interlanguage of the student is highly comprehensive through production. But why is that? Well, it seems that output forces the learner into more language processing. By negotiating meanings, learners will indeed modify their output in response to such conversational moves as clarification requests or confirmation checks. And what is found by a number of different researchers, among which Baika and others are the main ones, is that in response to clarification and confirmation requests, over 1/3 of the learner's responses were modified systematically, either semantically or morphosyntactically, which means that there is deep restructuring of the language. Let us now do a task. Let's look at this extract of a lesson for children. As you watch, keep these questions in mind. Which of the functions that we have just described about output was made evident in the production of students? How would you describe the output in this classroom extract?
This is a monster. It has one eye, big nose, two arms, two mouth, two legs, one foot, 7 toes.
In the extract we have just watched, we can clearly see how the student is monitoring his own production and trying to find out if there are any flaws in his production, even though he's a very young child. An amazing production. Now, when should we expect output? This was a question that we posed some slides before. Well, while there is input, that is, all the time. Bruner's description of linguistic scaffolding provides an interesting frame for the teaching strategies to be used. When should we expect output? Well, as we are providing input. This is done by articulating teaching strategies which combine input and output in interaction in class. But which are these teaching strategies that help us articulate both input and output? We can mention 3 main strategies: task sequencing, elicitation techniques, and diversity of interaction patterns as we establish them in the class. Let us pass on to task sequencing. Now, what are the questions that we should bear in mind when we are devising task sequences? The first question is, are tasks smoothly thread into the task sequence? Do we notice any gaps? Do we notice any flaws in the sequence that would not help students be able to produce the language? How do we assemble tasks that pass on from input into output? The second question is it necessary to introduce any specific language, that is, grammar or lexis, before the task? Do we need to include any vocabulary work before working with a story or a text? Well, this is something that we will see Carol Reed do in the next section of this class. How do we teach language before we tackle a task? Then, is there always an adequate proportion of new language, that is the new, with reference to known language, that is the given? Is there an adequate proportion? Is there too much new language that would make it difficult for the student to be able to take in the language and then produce it? And then the last, what task demand is there? What task support am I providing? How am I supporting students' learning, students' understanding, and eventually producing the language? In the next section of this class, Carol Reed, a very well-known researcher, is going to show us some of the techniques that are used to support student production by introducing new linguistic items, that is, by pre-teaching certain linguistic items that will be necessary for the task.